All right, let's get into our message. Here we are. We return right on time to our series on 1 Peter, Sojourners, stand fast through suffering. We will do a review as it really has been. We've been 4 weeks talking about other things, the 3 Jewish holidays, election day upcoming. So it's been 5 weeks since we've been in this series. So we will have a bit of a review. But before we do, I think we can all praise God that our election season is over. This, by the way, it's county by county. And so if you're partial, I like both red and blue, I do. But I'm a little partial to red, you may know. And so it's really interesting to see the breakdown, especially in our great state of Texas. Very, very interesting. Where are our cities? You can tell where our cities are. All right. But I want to show you something more important. And I think the biggest takeaway of this election, the biggest takeaway of the election season is that Kamala's husband, Doug Emhoff, he had his day in the sun, but I don't think he'll be remembered as the almost first gentleman. He'll always retain second gentleman status. But I think he'll go down in history as being bar mitzvahed in the same synagogue as I was. Temple Shalom, Matawan, New Jersey. On one side, you have Rabbi Wiener, or Henry Wiener is in both of them, our rabbi. 1977, you had Doug, who was a year ahead of me. And then 1978, you had me. Both of them bar mitzvahed within a year of one another. I think personally, this is how Doug will be remembered, as the guy who was bar mitzvahed in the same synagogue as Steve. But that's just me. That's just me. Let's get, isn't it interesting? I mean, how the mighty have fallen. It's really interesting. And Rabbi Wiener, well, yeah, he's passed away now, but he looked the same. All right, yeah, okay. Let's review chapter 3, the first 7 verses, and we will do some more verses after this. You remember 5 weeks ago, we had a big giant matzah ball of a passage. It is Peter's admonition of submission to wives, and then also talking to husbands in this chapter, but authority, talking about authority. So in the same way, you wives, in the same way as what? The previous passage, remember, is all about authority, to submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution. That was a few verses previous. And so in the same way, submit yourselves, wives, to your own husbands. And it's not talking about being a doormat to be walked all over. The issue is, even if any of your husbands are disobedient to the word, if they are not believers, or if they're, let's say, super inconsistent believers, your respect for your husband will result in the husband being won without a word by the behavior of their wives. So the way the wife, in other words, relates to the husband is definitely has an eternal component to it. Because, and it's not evangelistic or missionary marriage that we're talking about, but it is the example that our Messiah set, that talking that wives be in authority, be submissive to authority, in order that your husbands will be won to the Lord through the behavior of their wives. You'll remember 5 weeks ago, we talked about, and again, behavior being the key, we talked about, I gave you the example of my mother, whose life was really over a 41-year marriage, having married a Jewish guy who was not a believer, was nonetheless an example to him, so that by the end of her life, truly the very end of her life, the concluding days of her life, he was able to finally say, Eureka. Many of you remember my dad, Paul. He said, Eureka, and understood why my mother behaved the way she did. She was serving her Lord. And so he came to faith on her deathbed. The issue is here in chapter 2. This is the key. As they observe your chaste, your holy, and respectful behavior. So it is all about, it's not about mouth, it's not about communication, verbal communication. And I know for some ladies, that's challenging because your go-to is verbal expressiveness. But the issue is not verbal expressiveness in relating to husbands. According to Peter, the issue has to do with behavior, because the husband is always watching. And there's a reason the husband's always watching we'll get to when we get to verse 7 in just a moment. But your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses. So we're not talking about going crazy. But the issue is not hairstyles or jewelry, gold, silver, fancy schmancy, or dresses. Okay? It doesn't say, there's not a prohibition against braiding or wearing jewelry, because then you'd have to say it's a prohibition against wearing dresses. I don't want naked women walking around everywhere. That's not what Peter is saying. Okay? Styles change, fashions change. But what doesn't change is the hidden person of the heart. Let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable. Jewelry tarnishes, fashions go in and out. The hair that we started with in our 20s may not be the hair that we wind up with in our 50s or 60s. Comes and it goes. But the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit. That's precious in the sight of God. Again, this is not asking you to be doormats or dormice. To be gentle requires a tremendous level of strength. And a quiet spirit has less to do with your verbal output and more to do with respectful and focused attitude. Because that's precious in the sight of God. I have to tell you, there's a reason that God through Peter in 1 Peter 1 through 7 gives you 6 verses that are directed to the wives and only 1 verse directed to the husbands. It's not that the wives need 6 verses to get it together and the husbands pretty much have everything and just can summarize it all in 1 verse. No. It's that, not to be stereotypical or anything, but men are rather simple creatures. And we process information 1 tab at a time. Women are complex, and God is asking more of them than he asks of the man, because they can handle it. The imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, that's precious in the eyes of God. And while our society wants to celebrate and pushes our women to scream out, I am woman, hear me roar, dig me, because I'm riding the third, or is it on the fourth wave at this point, of feminism. And I like I am woman, hear me roar as a song. I love Helen Reddy. I was there in the 70s. I used to listen to it. I still listen to it. But as a philosophy of marriage, no. And that would be true for men as well. You'll remember last time we dealt with this. We showed two videos. One video, one clip, was from my Big Fat Greek Wedding, which discussed, in the immortal words of Lainey Kazan, the mother, that the man is the head, but the wife is the neck who turns the head. Right? So roaring is counterproductive. You want to fulfill the responsibility that God has given you as a partner, not a junior partner, but as a full partner in marriage together, man and woman together, that you have a role and the husband has a role. But speaking of the husband's role, you remember that second clip that I showed was from The Honeymooners. Jackie Gleason, I'm the boss here. Right? And we saw how that episode ended. And the wife turns the neck of the husband, of the head. And marriage only works when the partnership is functioning in the fashion to which God designed it. As Paul writes in Timothy, women should adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braiding, again, nothing wrong with braiding your hair or gold or pearls or costly garments. The issue is a matter of degrees. What's important, what defines you, is not the outer person, but the inner person, and the heart and the hands, rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. And Peter goes back to give you an example from the Hebrew Bible. And he's going to use Sarah. We talked about her this morning, earlier. Sarah as a prime example. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham. Again, there's nobody who's going to read the passages that concern Sarah and Abraham and say, Sarah is a doormat, Sarah is a dormouse, allowing herself to be walked all over. What a pathetic example for women. No, she's super strong, calling him Lord. And, I made a comment that, yes, it would be lovely to come home and welcome home, my Lord. But it's a culturally relevant signal of submission 4,000 years ago. Okay, to call a husband Lord today doesn't carry the same, shall we say, cachet as it did 4,000 years ago. It would be weird. Although, nice once in a while. Just say, calling him Lord. And you have become her children, wives, if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. What is it that a wife has to be frightened of? A believing wife, what does she have to be frightened of? First of all, there are many wives, and we know some wives, who are frightened of their husbands. As a breakdown, if a wife is frightened of her husband, there's a breakdown in verse 7. And you got one verse, do it right, and then your wife will not be frightened by you. But more so than frightened within marriage, is frightened within a peer system. As a believer, it would be challenging to be excluded from your circle of friends because of your faith. And that might be frightening. Now, let's just look at Sarah, for example, as an example, which is the example Peter gives us. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. So in the context of the scripture, this is where she calls him my Lord. Right? She laughs. The idea of them having a child is ludicrous. It's absurd. It's humorous to her. But God said to Avram, this is a chapter earlier, don't be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. Wait a minute, you just called him Lord. And yet God is telling Abram, listen to your wife? Yes. Why would God say whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her? Because you're partners. Because marriage only works when both partners are working together toward the same goal. In this instance, literally, Abraham may be the head, but Sarah is the neck that turns the head. That's this passage. Exactly. Listen to your wife. Husbands who do not listen to their wives often run into difficulty. You see, Sarah is the original Jewish mother and is Israel's ultimate example of proto-femininity. But just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling her Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any family. What are you going to be frightened of? Again, social ostracism. When you're playing the mahjong and all of a sudden your cronies, your friends, your pals, your mates no longer want anything to do with you because you believe in Yeshua. Remember, this is written within a Jewish cultural context and very much written to a Jewish remnant and the number one issue for Jewish people then and now regarding coming to faith in Yeshua is the fear of social ostracism. So do not be afraid of what man or what woman can do to you. There is no cost that isn't worth paying for Yeshua because he paid the ultimate cost for you. So, according to this passage, what does submission look like and how should submission be expressed? It's not a one-size-fits-all. Anybody who tells you that submission in marriage is one-size-fits-all and this marriage should look exactly like this marriage should look like, they don't know what they're talking about. How should submission be expressed? It's as unique as the couple. Is there a question that there is a positional roles for husband and wife? No question about it. But what does it look like? I don't know. What does your marriage look like? How should it be expressed? Work it out amongst yourselves. A wife, remember, is not to submit to the expectations of all men. Right? You see people right now going crazy on the internet because of the results of the election. They think we're about to enter into the Handmaid's Tale. You see these cockamamie costumes, they're wearing with the red robes and the stupid hats, because we're the patriarchy. No, it's not the patriarchy. A wife is not to submit to the expectations of all men, but the expectations of her specific husband. Ask him, how do you know what submission looks like within your marriage? You have to discuss this. Ask, is there anything that I do that rubs you in the wrong way, that seems disrespectful? Ask your husband. And husbands, express. Don't demand more than what the passage allows. But wives, don't try to skate through giving less than what the passage allows. Moving on. The one, remember, multiple tabs, okay? You know what I'm talking about. When your browser's open, you've got 40 tabs open. Generally, guys can't handle this. One tab at a time. And so we don't get the responsibility, the heavy responsibility of 6 verses. God knows women can handle it. Wives can handle it. Husbands, we get 1 verse. 1 specific set of instructions. And if we handle this, the rest should fall into place. You husbands, in the same way. In what same way as what? In the same submissive way. Even though the husband is the head, there is a submission involved. Husbands are to be submissive to the state of marriage as designed by God. In the same way, in the same submissive way. So live with your wives in an understanding way. What does it mean to live with your wives in an understanding way? From the moment that you marry your wife, you must become a student of your wife. Certainly, you surely were a student of your wife sufficiently, a sufficient student of your wife to have gotten her to say yes, right? To marry you. You had to learn a little bit to be able to get things to go your way. The responsibility to understand your wife doesn't stop when you says I do. It only begins there. Your job as a husband is to be a lifelong student. Know where the hot spots are. Know what buttons that will antagonize. Know what buttons will encourage. Know how your wife will be. So live with your wives in an understanding way. And we get to this next part, and everybody freaks out, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, to which I say male chauvinist pigs need love too. Anybody watching the Olympics, anybody watching sports of the past few years, you understand the point that generally speaking, with rare exceptions, of course, generally speaking, men are physically stronger than women. And so the issue here is to live with your wives, to know your wives in an understanding, in a knowledgeable way. One of the underlying ideas in this is that because you have the ability as a man to force yourself on your wife because you're stronger, she's weaker, don't do it. Because you're a student of your wife. Know your wife, right? Certainly regarding character, regarding stamina, regarding so many things, right? I mean, I faint at the sight of blood, right? Okay, so I couldn't handle being a woman. So as far as the stress, we just had a baby dedication, right? Forget about it, right? Women obviously have an innate strength that God gave them. I wouldn't want to compare the inner reserves of strength. It's not what we're talking about, the inner reserves of strength. It's simply physical weakness. Since she's a what? So therefore, because she is not as strong as you are. You have a responsibility. What is that responsibility? Responsibility number one, understand her. Responsibility number two, show her honor. How come? Because she's a fellow heir of the grace of life. She's a daughter of the King. You dare not treat your wife any less than you would the daughter of the King of Kings, of the Creator of the universe. You must show her commensurate. She's not only your wife, she is your sister. So this verse is all about husbands making sure you show up. The wives have a responsibility, and that's a tough responsibility to submit to your husband, especially, I have to tell you, especially if your husband is not a believer. That is a very large challenge. But even if your husband is the very paragon of Christian faith and virtue, it still requires a great deal of strength to submit to the authority, understanding that you are his partner. So therefore, you are to show her honor as fellow heir of the grace of life. And if you do not demonstrate honor and fellow heir and treat God as a fellow heir, your prayers will be hindered. If you don't show God the responsibility, if you don't act in a responsible way before God, understanding that you're living with your wife in an understanding way, showing her honor as a fellow heir, if you can't get that together, your prayers are going to be hindered. You can pray all you want. That's an admonition that's not given to the women, not given to wives, it's given to men. Only to men. If you screw this up, your relationship with your wife, you're screwing up your relationship with your God. You want to make sure your prayers don't hit the ceiling and go no further than that they're not hindered. Live with your wives in an understanding way. Show her honor. You want to encourage your husband, strengthen your husband, enable your husband to be able to live in a way that is appropriate as given here. Make sure, wives, you live in submission, respectful, holy, and chaste before your husband. Are husbands to define the command to be understanding with our wives and to show them honor? Should we understand being understanding and showing them honor as domination? The ideal here being that men dominate their wives? Absolutely not. Does Peter leave any wiggle room for domestic abuse in marriage? Absolutely not. There is no wiggle room. Submission does not mean domestic abuse. Either way. From husband to wife or from wife to husband. Let's broaden our understanding. Can this passage here, 1 through 8, chapter 3, be interpreted as allowing homosexual marriage? Let's open it up, right? Absolutely not. There's no room. We're going to tell you about husbands and wives. Not wives and wives, not husbands and husbands. The relationship doesn't work unless it's wives in relationship to husbands. Anything else is artificially imposed on the passage. Well, we have the Ephesians passage, which we looked at last time. I don't want to take time regarding the Ephesians passage. Understand? Well, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Ephesians 5. It's been 5 weeks since we looked at it. It's important to look at it again. Because Peter is simply expanding what Paul has talked about, or actually Paul is just expanding what Peter has compactly written about. And Paul writes regarding marriage, be subject to one another. See, that's in the same way, be submissive. You're both being submissive. It's not just one being submissive, it's both being submissive. But the idea is you're not doing it because I am man, hear me roar. I am woman, hear me roar. I'm the boss. None of that. It's in the fear of Messiah. And wives, be subject to your own husband as to the Lord. This whole passage for weeks prior, we've been talking about being in submission. Christ, our Messiah, was in submission to the Father, and therefore he gave his own life for us. And therefore, in the same way, we can be subject to authorities, to institutions, and in marriage, wives, we can subject to our own husband, not to someone else's husband, to your own husband, as to the Lord. Again, not to all men, the patriarchy. This is within the home. Be subject to your own husbands as you're subject to the Lord. See, and that's where some people actually, the whole model breaks down for them. They don't like the idea of being subject to the Lord, even though they're believers. I believe in Yeshua, and yes, I assent to the fact that he is Lord, but there are areas in my life that I have not submitted to his lordship. But nonetheless, that doesn't make it right. It means you've got a way to go in fulfilling this verse. Be subject to your own husbands. If you're not subject to the Lord, well, why should you be subject to your husband? It's a pro quo. But if you are subject to the Lord, be subject to your own husbands in obedience to him. For the husband is the head of the wife. And the model, the illustration that Paul uses here, Messiah is the head of the church. He is the body's savior, and the husband is the head of the wife. Again, that's where that big fat Greek wedding is so helpful. The wife is the neck. Well, if the neck doesn't want to be the neck wants to be the head. You've got two people vying for the head. That's a problem. The neck is actually pretty darn powerful because the neck turns the head, but the husband's the head of the wife. As Christ is also the head of the church, he being the savior of the body. For as the church is subject to Messiah, so also wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. There's not a lot of wiggle room there regarding, well, in some things, but not in this area. This area I retain for myself. I retain autonomy here. Everything means everything, not a few things, not some things, but everything. It's an attitude. Again, not being a doormat to be walked all over by either your husband or by all men, the patriarchy, oh, so oppressive. No, this is within the confines of marriage. And here comes the husband's part. You think the wife's part is tough? Try being a husband and fulfilling this verse. Love your wives. Got that. Piece of cake. I love my wife. But just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that's a bigger ask. Well, I'm a man. I have testosterone. If there were if there were a life and death situation and I had to lose my life in order to save my wife, I could be that hero. Congratulations. But that's not what the passage is saying. The issue is not a one-time, could you give your life up if you had to save your wife? That's not what it's saying. Love your wives to the extent that Christ loved the church and gave himself up. Christ gave his life. And that wasn't theoretical. That was actual. So if you want to be able to fulfill this verse, it means that every day of every week, of every month, of every year, for the rest of your life, you must live your life in such a way that you give your life for your wife. There's nothing abusive about that. There's nothing demanding about that. If wives and husbands both served the roles that Scripture had for them, then the marriage can be harmonious. Husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. If you don't care for yourself, if you've got self-hatred issues, yeah, okay, I could see how that would interfere with a marriage, right? If the husband actually doesn't love your neighbor, the whole idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, that breaks down if you don't love yourself, right? But if you're healthy emotionally and you love your body, then you would love your wife as yourself. No one hated his flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we're members of his body. Nevertheless, each individual among you is to love his own wife, even as himself. That is a big ask. And now you get to the conclusion here. The wife must see to it that she respects her husband. If your view of marriage, if your ideal model of marriage is Married with Children or The Simpsons or any of the sitcoms that are out there now, where the husband is basically an idiot and the kids are geniuses and so wise and the wife is really running things, that's a distortion. It's a cultural distortion of what the Bible speaks regarding marriage. What does it mean to respect your husband? Whatever it means, wives, you got to see to it. You better see to it. That requires doesn't come naturally. If it came naturally, you wouldn't have had instructions for either the guy or the gal, the husband or the wife. But the instructions require work for both the husband and the wife. The husband must love his wife to the extent that Christ loves the church, i.e., all in every day, giving your life up for your family, for your wife. The wife, you may say it's not as big an ask. I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, depending on who the husband is, depending on who the wife is. But she's got to see to it that her behavior is chaste and respectful, as Peter says, or simply that she respects her husband, as Paul says. And that's respect as understood by the husband, and received by the husband, not as understood and offered by the wife. If the wife thinks she's being respectful, but the husband isn't receiving or understanding that respect, then there's a disconnect that needs to be fixed. which is why communication in marriage is so important and why these things need to be dealt with ASAP and sometimes need to be revisited over time. If you think you're going to solve everything and get it all squared away in your 20s or 30s, I submit to you, you're mistaken. This is something that may require course correction throughout your marriage as circumstances change. And then, well, we're not going to do this part right here. We're going to stop right here. I took more time on the revisiting previous material simply because it's been 5 weeks. But you see the rest of the passage here between 8 and 12 is to sum up. To sum up what? Instructions regarding submission in marriage. Instructions regarding submission to authority. To sum up regarding submission to God. We're going to see what it looks like, practically speaking, next week. But for now, I'm going to need to leave you in suspense.